You are listening to the Primitive Intelligence Podcast, episode 505, Is Reality Really Real? And part one of my interview with Noah Healy. This is an extended episode. I hope your phone is charged. I hope your earbuds are charged. Get comfortable. You're going to be here for a while. Last episode, I teased, are we living in a simulation? We're going to talk about that idea. We're going to get to it. I know the last time I teased an episode in advance, I left you hanging, Jason. Not this time. We're going to get into simulation theory. So we're going to get into the idea. Is it just Hollywood mumbo jumbo? Some of my own thoughts on it and a surprising lack of answers. Also, later on in the episode, part one of my interview with Noah Healy. He's a market designer and game theorist, background in nuclear engineering. He worked for tech startups during the dot-com boom. He's the founder of CoreDisk, and he has a podcast of his own called The Fourth Age, which deals mostly with AI. This was a really long interview I had with Noah. It was almost an hour and a half we talked. So I split this in half. This week, we're going to talk about the simulation theory and some of his ideas about it. And then next week, we're going to do his business and what he does. And what he does is absolutely mind-blowing. Also going to talk about how coincidence plays a role in this episode. Finally, some podcast housekeeping before we get into the main episode. At the beginning of this season, I talked about how I want to expand the topics and I want to get guests and I really want to build a better podcast. Yes, it's true. This is my podcast. This is my passion project. It's my little pet. I love primitive intelligence. But at the end of the day, these episodes are for you. This is our podcast. Your feedback is paramount. I love it. I love getting feedback from listeners. And this is an entertainment podcast. I'm here to entertain you. I want you to be entertained. And part of that is knowing if you guys think I'm doing a good job. Feedback is key. Whatever platform you use to listen to or watch the podcast, please click that follow or subscribe button. If it asks for a rating or liking it, anything like that, comment, share. If there's topics you want me to cover or topics that you want to cover with me, technology has gotten to the point where you don't need to come here. I don't need to come to you. You don't need a podcast studio. You can use your phone. You and I can talk. You can be on the podcast if you want. How do you do that? Reach out to me. If you're on YouTube, you can leave me a comment. If you're on Spotify, you can leave me a voice note. You can just go to primitiveintelligence.com and click on the contact link or podcast@primitiveintelligence.com. My email address is back. The last holdout from my debacle last season of trying to get everything off that stupid server. The email address has been locked down. I've been giving you guys a Gmail address up until now. I finally got it straightened out. It's free. I'm able to get in. Podcast@primitiveintelligence.com. You can shoot me an email because I want to expand topics. I want to get more guests. Saying that, I've set up an account with a service called Matchmaker FM, and it sounds like a singles website, but it's not. It's actually like a classifieds for podcast hosts and guests, and it allows you to research each other and an easy way to connect, and I think it's awesome. It's a great platform. I've got some ideas. I've got some people that I've researched. I've looked into. A couple of them are authors. So I'm getting their books. I'm going to read up. I don't want to contact them and be like, hey, I don't know what you do. You want to be on my show? And we're going to see why I don't want to do that. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But for right now, that's enough jabbering. Episode 505 of the Primitive Intelligence Podcast. Is reality real? And the first half of my interview with Noah Healy starts now. This is such a big episode. I've got coffee today, no water. So a tie-in from last week. This is where coincidence plays its part here. I talked about coincidence and frequency of occurrence depending on my acknowledgement of those instances, at least in my experience. So I recorded episode 504 on Tuesday. I like to record late. So before I started recording, I went in and set up my account with Matchmaker FM. I record 504. I edit 504. I don't go to bed until about 3 a.m. Well, I kind of pass out at about 3 a.m. I get up in the morning. Because I do this as a video and audio, I have to let that video render. So that takes some time and let that happen overnight. So I come downstairs and I check the computer and make sure that everything rendered properly. and I see I have a message. Now, I'd already received a few when I first signed up, and this was a new message from someone new, and it was Noah Healy. And if he would only put an email about his work with financial systems, I probably would have been like, not for me, thank you very much, and I would have moved on. But I wake up that morning with coincidences running through my head because I'd just done an episode on it the night before. And in this email, first thing that catches my mind is he says, coincidentally, he's talking about the processes he uses in his programming. And one of them, he says, coincidentally, is called Fair Games. And he's like, that's the name of your season. I'm like, Fair Game is the name of my season. And you use coincidentally. And what am I getting ready to do? Simulation theory. He's into programming and game theory and mathematics and algorithms. Who better talk to about the possibility of reality being a simulation than this guy? So I email him back and I say, listen, yeah, your financial stuff, way out of my ballpark. But I'm willing to do that if you're willing to talk about simulation theory. And in the back of my mind, I kind of thought this guy's going to be like, I don't have time for that. But he emailed me back and he's like, yeah, I'm in. I'm paraphrasing. But he's like, yeah, I'm in. So we set it up. And I mean, he's been working on this stuff for over 25 years. I had less than 24 hours to prepare. That's nowhere near enough time. I hadn't started doing serious research, like really pulling information and getting my notes and everything together for this episode yet. And then I had to kind of research him, what he does, and try to make it coherent. Yeah, since he's actually my first real guest on the show. I mean, I co-hosted with Rocco when I first began. We did like the interview with the devil stuff back in season 1 and 2. Spoiler alert, that's just me with some effects on my voice. And then a couple episodes ago, I did the AI interview with ChatGTP. A little bit different, having an actual real guest in. But this is the growth of the podcast I wanted to do. Well, that was an acknowledgement of itself, of coincidence and how it can play a part in everything we do sometimes. And it just made me think about simulation theory even more. So what is simulation theory? Is it just Hollywood? Mumbo jumbo? Is it just the Matrix? Did this all come up because of the Matrix? And now people say things like glitch in the Matrix, and if there's a Mandela effect, it's a glitch in the Matrix. You see these videos of people on YouTube with the birds stuck in the air, and they look like they're flying. Oh, it's a glitch in the Matrix. We live in a simulation. It must be the Matrix. Did this all just come about because of a movie? No, you'd be surprised. It goes back further than that, a lot further than you'd think. Greek philosopher Plato, of all people, in his work Republic, he talks about the allegory of the cave, sometimes known as Plato's cave now. And basically, there's prisoners and they've been chained up their entire lives. All they can see is a blank wall in front of them with their shadows casting on it because there's a fire behind them and the light casts their shadows on the wall. That's the only thing they know. To them, that is reality. And the only way that they can know anything other than that is to escape the prison. Otherwise, reality is just shadows on a wall. Simulation theory is similar in that we don't really know. All we can see are the shadows on the wall. Back in 2003, Swedish philosopher Nick Bostrom wrote a paper called Are We Living in a Computer Simulation? And in this paper, he put forward the idea that one of 3 statements must be true. The first statement is all technological civilizations collapse or go extinct before reaching a technological maturity from which they could create simulations like our reality. Statement number 2, some technological civilizations reach a level of development at which they are able to create such a simulation, but for some reason choose not to. The third statement, we are living in a computer simulation already. One of those 3 must be true. To put that in a nutshell, as far as simulated realities go, either A, it never happens, B, it happens sometimes, or C, it's happening right now. That also means that there must be a base reality somewhere that is real that's not simulated. There are some people who believe that the odds of us being in that base reality are extremely low. One of those people is Elon Musk, maybe because it seems like an exciting thing to say, but he says that there's like 1 in billions chance that we're in that base reality. Some people who think we're in a simulation are trying to figure out ways of escaping the simulation. Is that even possible? If we are in a simulation, is it possible to exist outside of it? Could we escape a simulation? If you think a simulation is like a video game, could you imagine Mario jumping out of a video game and running away? It just wouldn't work. So I don't know. I don't know how we would do that. That kind of assumes that the computational power or even the computational processes, what makes the reality, what makes the simulation, is being based on what we know, the physics we know, and things like that. And I think that's pretty unlikely that if something was capable of creating a simulation this complex, that it would be based off of our technology. Now you may be wondering, okay, this is a great theory, but is there any proof that we do live in a simulation? Let me run some ideas past you. So the first one, it's based off of another argument I use with some people, kind of to piss them off. But when people say there's no possibility of alien life, and then they say, well, we're created by God, we're put here by God, and we are it, we're the ultimate, we're the favorites, it goes no further than us. The argument I always use is, well, if you don't believe in extraterrestrial life, and God put us on this planet, and God made the planet, then God can't be from the planet. He can't be from Earth. So by definition, God would be an extraterrestrial. And I mean it more as an exercise to get them to think about it. It usually just makes them mad. But if we take that same concept and we say that if God put us on this planet and God created the planet and the seas and the skies and the stars and the universe, then the universe is not a naturally occurring construct. It was created. It is artificial. We live in a simulation. Let me know how you feel about that one. Then, a little more modern, Professor James Gates from MIT claims to have found computer code in string theory by examining the equations used to define string theory itself, and that they are similar and sometimes exactly the same as what are known as Shannon codes. Now, Shannon codes are used in error correcting and data compression. If you've ever downloaded a piece of software and you get that checksum, that's a Shannon code. Now, I brought this up to Noah to see what he thought of this. And he hadn't heard of this, but he reminded me of something that I kind of knew and I kind of forgot, that there's a lot of problems with string theory. And string theory is based on multiple dimensions, and those dimensions get so complex that there's so much room for possibility that you could plug almost any equation in and it would work. Noah explains this a lot better later. But so is that what's happening here? I'm not sure if Gates is looking at the equation itself as a mathematical equation and just that, or if he's looking at the output of the equation. And he, from what I can tell, he's doing something to view the equations as images, and that's where he's seeing this computer code. Now, also, this guy is his main field of study is supersymmetry, which I couldn't even explain to you right now. This guy, he's not an idiot, so it's not like he just looked at a bowl of Cheerios and said, "I see codes." No, this guy knows what he's talking about. All these links will be in the show notes, so look at some of the stuff for yourself and make your decision. It could be he's seeing something that looks like one thing because it's string theory and that happens, or he's actually seeing code in these equations. That's just mind-boggling that there's, and I'm not talking about in the numbers, like in the equation, but as you break down the equations, the deeper you get, there's zeros and ones. There's binary code in there. That's crazy. The next thing that could prove that we're in a simulation is kind of a double-decker here, the Fermi paradox. For the Fermi paradox, you also have to look at what's known as the Drake equation. The Drake equation estimates civilizations in the Milky Way that are capable of communicating with us, or that would leave enough of an imprint that we would see that they're there. The Drake equation has a pretty big margin of error. On a real quick look, I saw anywhere between 1,000 and 100 million civilizations just in the Milky Way alone. That's still a lot of civilizations just in our galaxy. So the Fermi paradox is If this is true, and there's all these civilizations around, over the course of the lifespan of the universe as we know it, we should see some evidence of these other civilizations, and we don't. Of course, if you go back a couple episodes to the UAP episode, maybe we do. But we're not seeing it out in space as far as we know. We're not seeing evidence of civilizations coming from other stars. So it kind of would make it more probable that we are in a simulation because we're not seeing what we're expecting to see. And then the last part I'm going to bring up about proof that we live in a simulation is the fact that simply observing the universe changes the nature of the universe. And you may remember this from school when you're a kid, doing the light experiment that shows that light is also, acts as particles as well as a wave. And this kind of boils down to quantum physics and how crazy this all is. But there's scientists who have done this with electrons. They fired single electrons through a double slit experiment. And even with as small as electrons are, they should act as particles. But what they find is they act as a wave. So when they first did this, they thought there's got to be something interfering with the experiment. So they put a sensor in to watch the electrons go through the slits. As soon as they turn the sensor on, the electrons begin to act as particles. Turn the sensor off, they act as a wave. Turn the sensor on, they act as particles. Even in the middle of the stream, they will change. The electrons are reacting to the fact that they're being observed. This is quantum physics. Quantum physics will blow your mind. I know enough about it to be confused, but that right there opens a lot of really crazy possibilities. There's a lot of other things about quantum physics that are weird. Again, the links to this stuff will be, I'm not making this up, the links to this will be down at the bottom. How do electrons know that they're being observed? And why would they change their state? So I'm going to speculate. I'm going to have a little fun with this. This is for entertainment, after all. If we live in a simulation, how is it run? Is it a projection? Shadows on a wall? Like a hologram? Is it like VR? Is our consciousness viewing reality like it's playing a video game wearing a headset and it's just kind of peering in? Are our bodies just avatars having basic functions, kind of animalistic functions, but controlled by a, air quotes, installed consciousness, a higher consciousness? There is a train of thought, and I followed this train of thought. I've thought this for probably 30 years, that the brain is not the generator of consciousness. It is a receiver, meaning that our consciousness comes from somewhere else. How do we lose control? How do we have a temper if we're logical beings and our consciousness knows we should not be angry, right? We know, don't get mad at that, but we still do. It's like an instinct, like an animalistic act, and we have to calm ourselves down or we lose control. How is that possible if the consciousness is part of the body? I think it was in season 1. I was kind of joking, but I made the statement, and it kind of makes sense a little bit when you think of it this way. And what I said was, how does the brain, the thing that's thinking the thought, not know how the thought is thunk? Can you answer that? How do we not know how we work? That is a question I've had since I was a kid. If you look at things like past lives, reincarnation, ESP, dreams, out-of-body experiences, these things make a lot more sense if consciousness is coming from somewhere else and not being generated by the brain. And I say this because look at out-of-body experiences. There are enough reports that are consistent enough to believe that OBEs, there's something to them. But if our consciousness needs the brain, if it's generated from the brain, how does it get outside the brain? How do we leave our bodies? How do kids have, infants, barely old enough to talk, they have memories of past lives? If consciousness isn't generated by the brain, that makes more sense. And if it's not generated by the brain, it's coming from somewhere else. Does that mean that we're just non-player characters that wind up getting chosen to, to be played in the simulation? Is that possible? If matter itself is intelligent, electrons can change their state. Could it create anything we imagine? Could matter be its own processor, generating reality on the fly? Imagine the pixels on your TV screen or your phone being their own processors, being their own CPUs and not needing another processor. Imagine how fast that would be. You'd have all the computing power you would ever need. Our knowledge of our out-of-sim selves could be suppressed, as could be our ability to imagine and create and explore and build. That may all be limited. If we created a simulation, would we want our sims to be able to create a simulation that could create a simulation, that could create a simulation, that could create a simulation? Is that something that we would want? Is that something, would that take up more power? Would it even be possible? Maybe this has all been thought of already and determined it's bullshit. I don't know. I'm not that smart of a guy. Who is that smart of a guy, though, is my next guest. Noah Healy is a market designer and game theorist working on better economic systems. After training in nuclear engineering, he worked for tech startups in the dot-com boom. Becoming fascinated by the mathematics of information and computation led him to patent work on a better commodity market design. That's what I've got coming up right now. Sit back and enjoy the interview with Noah Healy that starts right now. So it's my pleasure to introduce this week's guest, Noah Healy. If you just want to tell us a little bit about yourself, and we'll just jump right into it.
Sure. Thanks, Kurt. So you got my name already. I was born and raised here in Charlottesville, Virginia. Went to UVA and been working in computers for the last quarter-ish of a century. And also my hobby is computational mathematics. And about a decade ago, I discovered a better way to do price discovery for commodity and some other financial markets. And so I've been working to get economics upgraded.
That's something that desperately needs to be upgraded. As a business owner myself, I know it's not well prepared right at the moment. But with your background in computer sciences and all that, there is discussion that we may be living in a simulation. It was virtually made popular in 2003, and with the theory is that one of three possibilities has to be correct. Either all civilizations that could possibly be in the universe will gain the technology to create simulations, or some will but won't, or we are already living in a simulation. With your background in computer sciences and programming and mathematics, what do you see any possibility that could be true, that we are or could be living in a simulation?
Well, the fun thing is that we have to get into a little bit of what we mean by living in a simulation. So the model that your individual experience as a result of a computation being carried out by a civilization that's simulated you in order to carry out one of these strategic brain problems, for example. That's one version of living in a simulation. Another version of living in a simulation is that the universe is operating off of computational principles, and there's an intelligence that essentially wrote the program that is operating the universe. And so in that scenario, which could be analogous to the first one, but this would be another kind of living in simulation. Here's where computational mathematics makes things really fun. If we observe our universe and sort of how many particles that are in it and so on, we get this sort of free entropy. So there's so many particles. There's essentially about 2 to the 300 particles in our universe, which means that if you were to sort of examine the entire universe, on average, there would be every single combination of coin flips that are possible over that frame. So if every particle that was in the universe were to flip a coin, and they were all to be subdivided into groups of 300, one of those groups would all flip heads, and one of those groups would all flip tails. And one of those groups, when you line them up in one particular order, would have one particular order of heads and tails, and for every order of heads and tails that you could possibly want. Those computational systems that Turing talked about, they're quite small. And Stephen Wolfram, if you're familiar with Wolfram Alpha, that's his baby. He also was the company that created Mathematica. He's pursuing and attempting to promulgate the hypothesis that the physics of our universe is based off of computation, that our entire universe is actually just a computer. He offered a bounty, and a proof was made that a system that he found that's definable in, I think, 28 bits is computationally complete. It's capable of that thing Turing talked about. So the free entropy of our universe is 10 times the size required to create a computational system. Which means that based on what we know about mathematics, the entire universe as a program on a computer, the entire universe as a purely random accident, and the entire universe as a conscious creation through a word in that interpreter sense I was talking about before, are all, to a great extent, logically equivalent with one another. So it's not that it could be one that, or the other, or it's that all three of these things could be simultaneously true. And depending on which sort of philosophical point of view you decided to take on it, you could convince yourself that that was the only possible truth.
Right.
So that's the limit of what we can see, basically. We're the lower bound for the universe being able to be a self-created simulation or whatever is exceeded by the amount of random chance that we observe being available. Does that make sense?
So, in a way, yeah. My thought to that was always that we are basing the computational power that would be needed to create a universe, a reality such as our own, on our own knowledge of computational power and structure.
Well, so let me blow your mind with something.
Oh, okay. I'm ready for this.
There's an incomputable sequence called the busy beaver numbers.
Okay.
And this sequence grows faster than any sequence that you can imagine. And it doesn't start off all that fast. So the way the busy beaver numbers work is you use that Turing machine thing that Turing came up with. It's a binary machine. It can only draw a mark or erase a mark. And it's not the full Turing power machine. It's got a finite number of states, and it has it has no preloaded tape, but it does have access to an infinite tape. And so the question is, given a certain number of states, how many how much of the tape can it mark up and then stop? And for one state, the answer is 1. And for 2 states, the answer is 3. We used to think, I think it's 4 states. We used to think that we knew what 4 states was, and it was in the hundreds, but then somebody found a way to do 4,096, and we're not so confident that that's actually what 4 states is anymore. For 5 states, the number is at least a number that, so 10 to the 10, 10 billion, 10 to that power would be a 1 with 10 billion zeros after it, like 15 of those.
Wow. In 5 states.
In 5, yeah. And the fun fact is that no matter what you're thinking of in terms of big numbers, if you've heard of things like Graham's number or the tree numbers or birds, whatever big number stuff you've heard about where there's some way to make really, really big numbers really, really quickly out of really, really small numbers. Not even close. Not even close to close. Because as soon as there's enough states in the Turing machine to describe whatever that process that you can think about is, that becomes the lower bound of how much that can do. Because it can do that, at least. So this is whatever the most capable thing is at each level. And the growth rate of that curve is literally faster than we can imagine. And that's why, with access to around 300 bits, it may well be possible from a Busy Beaver perspective, for a system to demonstrate a degree of complexity that's beyond our imagination. We don't know what those Busy Beavers from 4 and up are. We know that there's an upper limit of Busy Beaver numbers that we could ever know, and we don't know where that limit is, and that's one of the things that's incomputable.
So we know there's a limit, we just could never figure out what that limit is.
Yes.
Is that one of those unimaginable imagination things you were talking about?
Exactly.
It's something we just could never imagine. That's crazy.
We can make words that make us think that we're thinking about it, but we literally can't think about it because that's impossible.
That's okay. Yeah, that's the kind of stuff I like right there. If you can't even imagining the imagination, then it's out there pretty far.
Well, and that's if you play around in computational mathematics, you play in a world where that is a frequent companion, and as you've just experienced, it's a lot of fun.
So you're saying a number with more zeros than there are probably stars in the universe.
Oh, well, that, like I said, at 5, you're already well past that limit.
Well past that at 5. Wow.
Yes.
So yeah, and you could never even imagine that number of stars in one galaxy, much less, in our night sky, much less a galaxy or all the galaxies. And then that's minuscule compared to the lower limit that we know of right now.
Right. Exactly. And these kinds of things just pop up all over the place. The Busy Beaver numbers actually aren't even the fastest growing incomputable sequence we're aware of. And then there's ideas about oracles where you introduce the unimaginable. So I'd said that this debugging software is impossible. So we could assume an oracle. We say, well, what if it was possible? What if we had this thing that just told us what the answer was? Well, because of the structure of the argument about why these things are impossible, that thing that could do all the things that we can't do would have a set of things that it couldn't do that would be on the far side of its impossibility. So a few months ago, I was thinking through how you could demonstrate an oracle with busy beavers and how you could sequence out oracles by introducing marks on the tape, basically, for the oracle, so that it knew what the boundaries were, so that you could just go to where those boundaries were, and how then the relationship between the functions at different levels, so not necessarily the numbers of oracular busy beavers, but the kinds of functions that would be possible at different levels. That was fun.
Did you get anywhere with it?
For the first few, like I said, we don't really know much about the fourth and higher busy beaver numbers, but I did have a few thoughts on a couple of different approaches to allow for different kinds of streams and conceiving of hyper-infinite sequences of those sorts of things. And so you could create what I call the hyper-busy beaver numbers, which is sort of a diagonalizing limit point of oracular busy beavers for creating deeply unimaginable things. But I can't attach any reality to that. So it's more just an intriguing speculation.
You were just talking about debugging, and as I was researching into simulation theory, one of the things I found, which was kind of mind-blowing, Professor James Gates from MIT was investigating the equations that define string theory. And the further he got into looking at these equations, and I'm not sure how he was doing it. He was looking at like fractals based off of these equations or something like that. I glossed over it pretty quickly today, but he was finding code, the computer code in these equations that weren't put there by the people who wrote the equations, but however he found it. But what he found out that they were checksum codes that are written kind of hard coded into the equations of the definitions of string theory. And I found this by accident. It was a feed that popped up, and it was Neil deGrasse Tyson talking to him, and he's kind of questioning him like, you mean you're finding computer code in these equations? And I kind of thought it was one of these deep fake things until I actually looked it up and found out that they're finding debugging codes in theories in equations when you look at them as an image or as a fractal. Have you heard anything about that? Is that something?
So I've not seen that. I've seen some studies examining high-powered cosmic rays and the scattering structure of extremely high-powered cosmic rays, and they break down supposedly into structures that imply, and this is one of the things Stephen Wolfram tries to bring out to bolster his theories, that imply a substructure, a computational substructure to the universe. In terms of the equations of string theory, one of the issues with string theory is that the high-dimensional mathematics of use there is known to be underspecified. So sort of the thing that got string theory sort of excited in the first place was they had this mathematical formalism that math did a lot of work on, and they knew was true. And when you plugged the what was known about quantum physics into it, certain certain values that weren't predicted parts of the theory dropped out of the equations. And so that was very exciting, the notion that these mathematical forms in group theory might be being reflected in the physical universe that we adopt. However, replicating what's known isn't really the mark of a functioning theory. Creating new predictions is. And so the string theorists, pooped out a bunch of predictions, and then they went off and started measuring them, and they didn't get them right. But they took the numbers that came in and plugged those into the system, and were like, oh, look, they fit perfectly in with the system. And they make all these new predictions. Well, those didn't work either. But those new numbers also fit perfectly within the system. And ultimately it was discovered that with the number of dimensions that they had involved, anything fit perfectly within the system. There was just enough flexibility to cope with whatever you did. So topologically, higher dimensions start becoming very boring very quickly in many cases, because there's so much freedom that sort of all the structures are the same. So as an example, for everyone who's ever tied their shoelaces, that is something that you can essentially only accomplish in three-dimensional space. If you have lines in four-dimensional space, there's sort of two different directions. So just like if you have stuff that's sort of stuck on the floor and it can't pass each other because, they're stuck on the floor and they can't get over each other. But if we've got three dimensions, we can lift one over and one under and tie ourselves knots. In four dimensions, we would have one more direction other than under and over. And so even after tying a knot, we would be able to move things out in that fourth dimension so that they weren't engaged with each other anymore, and just undo them. And we would always be able to undo them under those circumstances. And the base string theory was a six-dimensional space. And it turns out that in that space, there was just so much room that no matter what the theorists or what the measurement guys, the experimentalists, came up with, you would be able to plug it in and get a viable, coherent set of numbers that would make a new set of predictions. And since the predictions kept not coming up, they kept not coming up. So he might be operating in good faith, and that might be there. For that to be, for a string theory thing to be interesting, those checksum codes would have to have some kind of practical, measurable reality before I'd care much about it.
Right. Now, but I don't know if he's actually looking at what the equations actually do, but just the equations themselves. I don't know if it's particularly just because it's string theory. That's the equations he was looking at. It was just, to me, it seemed like, he even said in his, when he said, he goes, we don't even understand what we're looking at with this. Well, but it seemed like it was more of the equations, but less of the answer to the equation and more the equation itself.
Well, another point would be that because math is all connected, computation equals computation. And so string theory, like I said, is based off of a very advanced piece of work in group theory. And I would be unsurprised if it turned out that some of these group structures turned out to be Turing complete and computational systems in and of themselves, because addition plus multiplication is Turing complete over the integers, for example.
Right. So like you're saying with in string theory, just because he found these checksums, he could have looked at it as anything and it probably would have fit because there's so much freedom in it.
that might well be what's going on, and
Right.
I'd have to investigate before that wouldn't be my default assumption. But like I said, I've seen astrophysics papers where they were looking at the scattering structure of and discovering slight errors in something called aneantropy. So aneantropy is essentially the theory that the universe doesn't have a direction.
Okay.
So no matter what way you're facing, physics shouldn't be any different. You know, the laws of physics shouldn't change whether I'm looking west or north. Right? Well, maybe that's an assumption. That assumption
Right.
is aneantropy. So when you look at incredibly high-powered particles, we actually should expect them to come from specific directions because, for example, there's a lot of matter in the way inside the galactic disk, but on the other hand, that's also where a lot of the stars that produce these things are, and so we should be able to sort of figure out what's going on with those directions, and figure out when extremely high-powered gamma rays and other cosmic rays show up from outer space. They should be roughly coming according to the probability of the kinds of things that are in the direction that we're looking at. And they discovered that that's not quite true, that there seemed to be a rectilinear ish bias where certain directions were good and certain other directions were bad, irrespective of the actual shielding plus sourcing in a given direction, suggesting that there could be some fundamentally shaped structure of space that made certain directions easier to travel than others.
It's kind of like polarize or solarizing on a pair of glasses. You look one way and it's a little brighter than another, something like that, or like the actual shape or direction.
Let's say you're playing a video game, right? And you've got it's old school, it's pixels. So you've got the old like number pad that's only got 4 directions on it. You can move side to side, you can move up and down. You can't move diagonally very well. And and even if they were, sharp enough to make the diagonal moving work, you can't move slightly diagonally very well. You don't have full 360. The sensors on the pad only give you 8 or 16 or 32 directions. They don't give you an infinite number of directions. And so if you were to assume that Link or Mario or one of these characters had full 360 degree movement and track their motions, you'd say, well, this is weird. Mario World should be aneantropic, right? That's how physics is supposed to work. But somehow Mario only ever travels in one of 128 different directions and never travels in any other directions. What's up with that? Well, Mario exists on this grid that has, certain animation things that make traveling in those directions easy and make traveling in the other directions impossible. Now, it's not quite as harsh as that with what they were discovering, but it's similar to that kind of behavior.
Cosmic rays can only move up and over.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Cosmic rays traveling in certain directions look like that's easy to do, and in other directions that are close, but which might have some kind of grain to them at galactic and intergalactic scales, don't seem to show up.
So it's the pixelated universe?
That's what they're coming up with, yes.
That's pretty wild. So yeah, wow. That's the first time I've heard that. That's pretty incredible. I don't have the information here, but like the double slit experiment, there was a group that was doing it with, I think they were using single molecules. I think they were sending through, and they start to realize that they would act one way when observed and another way when not observed. But in order for that to happen, they would have had to change their state before they left where they sent them from. And they couldn't figure out how these single molecules had the intelligence behind them to change their state to know that they're observed.
Well, that's the basic problem of quantum physics, is that we have these equations that make predictions that when we measure things, the predictions, are correct, basically. But the mechanism, there are a pretty large number. I think I'm aware of about half a dozen interpretations. None of those interpretations are particularly sensible from our sort of colloquial world. I remember a cousin's child was asking me some questions, and I was telling him about electrons, and he asked me how big they are, and I said, well, theoretically, and as we generally accept, they're sizeless. They have no dimension whatsoever. And he said, that doesn't make any sense. And I said, that is correct.
You got it.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. It does not make any sense.
It exists, but it doesn't exist.
It's not, it exists. That might be, it's the best we can do, this explanation that we know doesn't make sense. But right. It does make predictions, and it makes predictions pretty accurately.
The simulation thing was probably not what you were excited about talking, but I appreciate you humoring me on that and giving me some information that I will probably keep me awake tonight researching.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, there's a lot of different avenues. The one that I actually find more interesting, and something that I devote some brain power to every once in a while, is that multiplication is known to be more difficult than addition. It's not as much more difficult as it used to be. In the 20th century, we developed a handful of much more efficient multiplication algorithms. But we're pretty sure that we know exactly how hard it is to multiply things, and we're pretty sure we know exactly how hard it is to add things. But if you're familiar with Euclid's elements and the Euclidean plane geometry, it's easier to multiply things in Euclidean geometry than our current belief about the easiest way to multiply things. So I'm not sure why that is. There seems to be a link between Euclidean geometry and all other forms of math through things like the Cartesian plane. But there are certain things about the abstraction of the Euclidean plane that we understand to be impossible to physically realize. And so are those physical impossibilities incorporated into our algebraic and computational understandings in ways that we aren't quite clear on that account for the difference? Or is the Euclidean plane itself an imaginary abstraction that doesn't really exist because it implies the ability to do things that can't really be done?
So perception is everything? We think that's impossible, so therefore it is?
More like we believe things are possible that are actually impossible. And so we do these things in spite of the fact that they don't work. So think about, medicine. Medicine's existed among humans since time immemorial. And there's been things that people have been able to do that are helpful. Setting bones is something we can find archaeological evidence for that's, basically contemporaneous with like fire and stuff like that. Right. But we happen to know that the scientific revolution finally hitting medicine in the late early 1900s essentially lifted doctors out of the state of killing as many patients as they helped to modern medicine, where people actually got better as a result of the interventions that were being done because we'd actually learned something. But the doctors of, George III didn't know that they were killing their patient, and nobody else knew that either because they weren't executed for murdering a king after they did it. So people thought that medicine existed and that people could do it, and they were wrong. And as a result, lots of people got killed who would have gotten better if they'd been left completely alone. And much worse than that, there were helpful things that they did know how to do, and if they'd restricted themselves strictly to the helpful things that they knew how to do, then they would have been able to do benefits even centuries or millennia ago.
Right.
So if people are deluded into believing that the impossible is possible, and they build their lifestyles and societies around falsehoods, then we do enormous amounts of damage to ourselves. And so discovering where these limits are, and these intuitions about reality, like nobody thought relativity or quantum physics is obvious. But without access to that information, we wouldn't be able to make GPS work, because quantum physics is actually necessary to designing the chips and systems that go into the satellites, and relativity is necessary to time the clocks that are in the satellites, because they actually don't move at the same speed as clocks on the ground because of how fast they're going in orbit. And so breaking down our intuitions and discovering actual reality is, I think, something that has a lot of value and also a lot of room to run. There's a lot of things that we thought were true that got disproven by Alan Turing in the 30s. Like I said, the progress of multiplication, one of the top computational mathematicians of the 20th century decided to look into multiplication, and he decided that the way that we teach kids how to do it, if you remember the wedding cake addition thing for multi-digit multiplication, he played around and decided that was as good as you could do. And the story I've read suggests that he worked on it for a few months. So he went to a conference. He was a Soviet, a Russian. So he goes to a conference, well regarded, and gives a lecture, and says, I looked at this, and this is just it. It's a quadratic problem. It's basically as difficult as the square of the number of digits in the numbers. And he was contacted, I think, about a week later by a guy named Karatsuba, who was a teenager at the time. And Karatsuba had discovered an algebraic technique that reduced it from a quadratic problem to a 1.5 exponent. So you cube the numbers and then take the square root is how hard the Karatsuba approach was. And he's one of the top minds of the 20th century, was convinced enough by his own experience. He didn't know for sure, but he was like, yeah, that's the line. That's just how bad it is. And, some kid just in a week
it didn't know.
Redefined.
He was
yeah. Played around, was like, oh, how about this? Yeah. And now we actually have a proof about, how hard we presently think it is. And that algorithm has been implemented. Your computer doesn't use it because the perfect algorithm is faster than the thing your computer uses after the size of the numbers is larger than your computer can reasonably have in it. So, so we don't get a lot of value out of the perfect multiplication algorithm. But still, that proof exists, and it's contradicted by Euclidean multiplication, which was, explained to schoolboys for a few thousand years. What's up with that?
That I couldn't tell you. You'd know more about that than I would. I'm not a recreational mathematician. I hike. That doesn't solve a lot of equations.
Yeah. Well, that's good too.
Yeah, it's a different kind of problem solving for me to get out there and hike.
Sure.
I saw that you do a podcast. Are you still doing that?
Yes, I am. It's called The Fourth Age, the AI Revolution.
The Fourth Age.
A guy named Marty Wiener, who's the retired CTO of Reddit, and I are talking about AI and how computational technology is wiping out our existing societies, and what we might be able to do or really ought to be doing to build societies in their stead.
If you write any books or anything like that, definitely let me know. I'd love to read it. I'm not going to pretend to understand it, but read it and maybe even have you back on.
Okay. Good deal.
All right. I want to take a minute to thank Noah again for joining me for that conversation. I'm sure my befuddled look through a lot of that was the entertainment value was probably enough to make his week. There's the next part of the interview where he goes into his economic systems and all that. I thought I had enough of a tech background to keep up with what he was talking about. There's parts in this interview where I look like a rabbit trying to figure out how to reassemble a helicopter. It's fascinating stuff. I know what he's saying, but my old noggin's taken too many knocks, I think. I was having a hard time keeping up. It really is fascinating stuff. And it's the kind of thing I want to expand into. Maybe not that all the time, but different points of view, different things, what I'm going for with primitive intelligence. I hope you guys really enjoyed that. Next week is going to blow your mind with some of the stuff that he talked about. I really feel bad because I only had like 24 hours, less than 24 hours to research anything that I thought he might talk about. It happened really quick, and I was way underprepared. So I'm going to try not to do that again in my next interviews. Again, Noah, thank you very much for your time. I appreciated it. It was a lot of fun talking to you. And next week will be the rest of that interview. And until then, think about things that you've seen that may not be real. Think about what you've experienced in your life that may indicate that we live in a simulation. I've got a question for you. Have you ever had this happen? This happens to me pretty commonly, and it drives me nuts. Either driving down the road or being a passenger in a car, and you're just kind of looking out the window, and you see someone walking, and you just kind of look at them. And now I kind of do it on purpose to see if I can actually see the person. But you see them walking, and as you're about to see their face, like a signpost just kind of blocks your view. And then as a signpost, they clear the signpost, there's a tree. And then as the tree goes by, there's like a kid with a balloon that blocks their face. And then you turn a corner and you don't see them. It happens a lot. It's like the universe was like, oh, that one wasn't rendered. You weren't supposed to see that one yet. Sometimes I just feel like stopping the car and hopping out and running around a corner and looking at them. Are you real? Are you a real person? I don't do it though because I don't want to get locked up. But yeah, have you ever had that happen? Let me know. That's going to do it for this episode of the Primitive Intelligence Podcast. Thank you for staying tuned for this extended version. I know there was a lot of information in there, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you in episode 506. See ya.